The June air of 1945 breathed a damp, heavy heat that General Field Marshal Friedrich von Arnheim could never get used to. The air of Virginia, thick and dense as wet wool, was saturated with unfamiliar scents of blooming magnolia and decaying leaves, the sense of a world that had not known war. The canvas-covered truck shuddered over the ruts of the country road, and each jolt sent a dull ache through old wounds and a sharp pang through his wounded pride. Beside him, on the hard benches, his companions in misfortune sat in silence. A dozen of the highest-ranking officers of the once great Wehrmacht. Their faces, usually impenetrable masks of authority, were now ashen gray with exhaustion and uncertainty. They rode in silence. All the words had been said back in Europe, amidst the smoking ruins of their world. Now only silence remained, the silence of defeat. Von Arnheim peered through a slit in the canvas at the passing landscape. Lush green fields, neat white farmhouses, herds of fat cows lazily chewing grass. This peaceful, well-fed, almost obscene serenity provoked a dull irritation. There were no bomb craters here, no skeletons of burnt-out vehicles, no thin children with the eyes of old men. This country had not paid the price his homeland had. Finally, the truck stopped. A sharp squeal of brakes, the clang of the tailgate being thrown open. "Out! Move it!" a young guard shouted in English. His voice was thick with poorly concealed hatred. They disembarked onto the sun-scorched earth. Before them lay Camp Clinton, endless rows of identical wooden barracks surrounded by a double perimeter of barbed wire. On the watchtowers, the silhouettes of sentries loomed. Everything was drearily functional, devoid of even a hint of improvisation. This was not a camp built in haste on the front lines, but a solid, well-thought-out institution, a factory for holding prisoners. An officer met them, a captain with a weary face and indifferent eyes. He read out the rules in broken German that grated on the ears. No talking to the guards. Reveille at 6, lights out at 10. Any disobedience would be punished. It was a standard procedure, devoid of emotion. The humiliation lay precisely in this impersonality, in their transformation from makers of history into mere inventory numbers. They were led to a separate, slightly more spacious barrack with a sign that read, Block D, Senior Ranks. Inside were 2 rows of bunk beds, a table, and several benches. The windows were covered with mesh. The air was stale and hot. "Get settled. Dinner is at 1800 hours. The escort threw at them and slammed the door. The lock clicked with deafening finality. The generals dispersed to their bunks. No one uttered a word. Von Arnheim sat on a lower bunk, running his hand over the rough mattress. He thought about the upcoming dinner. It would be the first act in a play of humiliation. He vividly imagined a tin bowl of murky, tasteless liquid, a piece of stale bread. It was familiar. In the final months on the Eastern Front, even at Army headquarters, they had to make do with such fare. And in besieged Berlin, they said there wasn't even that. He and his comrades were soldiers. They knew how to endure. They would meet this test with dignity, as befitting Prussian officers. They would show these well-fed American boys that the German spirit could not be broken by hunger. He looked at his companions. General Oberst Straube, the former quartermaster of Army Group Center, a man who was a human abacus, was already mentally calculating the calories in the hypothetical gruel. Admiral Klug, whose destroyers now rested at the bottom of the Atlantic, stared out the window with unseeing eyes, as if trying to glimpse the distant sea beyond the Virginia hills. Only SS Brigade Führer Rommelbauer, the fanatic with burning eyes, seemed almost inspired. "They will try to break us, gentlemen," he hissed, his eyes sweeping over them. "They will use hunger, disease, lies. But we are steel. Our will was forged in the furnace of a great idea. We will endure." Von Arnheim remained silent. He had long since stopped believing in great ideas. All that remained was duty and the memory of honor. The field marshal's gaze fell on the young guard peering into the barracks barred window. Corporal Leo Kowalski. Von Arnheim had noticed him by the truck. In this young man's eyes swam a hatred so pure, so undiluted, that it was almost tangible. He looked at them not as captured soldiers, but as personal enemies. It was men like him, von Arnheim thought, who would take sadistic pleasure in serving them their meager rations. Well, he was ready. He fastened the top button of his collar, squared his shoulders, and prepared for his first dinner in captivity. The tension in the stuffy barrack grew, thick and heavy like a thundercloud before a downpour. Corporal Leo Kowalski hated Block D and its occupants. To him, they weren't just prisoners. They were living symbols of everything he despised. His memory was filled not with newspaper articles, but with letters from his aunt in Krakow, full of terror and pain, and then a long, ringing silence. These men in their elegant, albeit worn uniforms, with their aristocratic posture and cold eyes, were the architects of that hell. And now he, Leo Kowalski from a Chicago suburb, had to carry their food. When the sergeant assigned him to serve dinner to the general's barrack, Leo took it as a cruel irony of fate. But then he saw an opportunity, a chance to look them in the eye at their moment of humiliation. He imagined setting down bowls of prison slop before them and seeing their arrogant faces flinch. It would be his small, personal revenge. At 6 o'clock, he and another soldier rolled a cart to the mess hall. The cook, a portly and perpetually sweaty sergeant named Hank, was plating the portions on metal trays. Leo glanced into the pot and frowned. "What is this, Hank?" "Roast beef, Corporal. And this is mashed potatoes. And green beans. Standard Tuesday rations," Hank boomed, not looking up from his work. Leo stared at the tray. On it lay a substantial slice of roasted meat, a generous mound of mashed potatoes smothered in gravy, canned green beans, 2 slices of dazzlingly white bread, a pat of butter, and a mug of steaming coffee. The smell was rich, meaty, and familiar. "This is for them?" Kowalski asked, disbelieving. "Who else? Colonel Wallace's orders. Ration Category C. Same as our boys in the barracks get. Geneva Convention, son. Now get moving. It'll get cold." The feeling of anticipation turned to bitter disappointment and bewilderment. This was not a dinner for defeated enemies. This was a dinner his mother made on Sundays. Grabbing 2 trays, he practically ran towards Block D. Anger boiled inside him. What convention? Did these generals remember conventions when their armies were burning villages in his Poland? He roughly pushed open the barrack door. The generals, seated at the table, looked up. Their eyes held a tense expectation. Leo slammed the first tray down in front of von Arnheim. The field marshal slowly lowered his gaze to the food. His eyebrows twitched almost imperceptibly. Kowalski set down the other trays, deliberately careless, trying to make as much noise as possible. He expected any reaction, a contemptuous smirk, an angry word, a stoic refusal to eat. But instead, a silence fell. A deep, strange, almost deafening silence. 12 pairs of eyes were fixed on the trays. They looked at the food as if they were seeing a ghost. SS Brigade Führer Rommelbauer suspiciously prodded a piece of meat with his fork, as if checking it for poison. Admiral Kluge picked up a piece of white bread and examined it for a long time, turning it over in his fingers like a rare jewel. Von Arnheim picked up his knife and fork. His movements were as precise and measured as if he were on parade. He cut a small piece of meat, brought it to his mouth, and chewed. Slowly, thoughtfully. His face remained impassive, but something in his eyes had changed. Some invisible wall inside him had cracked. He cut another piece, then another. The others, watching him, followed his example. They ate, but it was not like how hungry men eat. They did not fall upon the food. They ate slowly, almost ritually, with a strange, focused expression on their faces. It was as if they were not just satisfying their hunger, but participating in some incomprehensible sacrament. The sound of forks and knives striking the metal trays was the only sound in the barrack. Kowalski stood at the door, bewildered. His revenge had not happened. Moreover, he felt like an idiot. He had come to enjoy their humiliation, and instead, he was witnessing a scene whose meaning he could not grasp. They did not look humiliated. They looked stunned, as if this simple American dinner had hit them harder than an artillery barrage. Something wrong? He couldn't resist asking sarcastically in English. Von Arnheim looked up at him. His gaze was cold, but deep within it, for the first time, Leo saw not arrogance, but something else, something akin to a bottomless weariness. "Everything is in order, Corporal," the Field Marshal replied in surprisingly good English. "Everything is more than in order." He lowered his gaze back to his plate. General Straube, sitting next to him, muttered something in German to von Arnheim. Kowalski, whose German was weak but sufficient to catch the gist, understood only a few words. Real coffee, sugar, incredible. Leo stepped out of the barrack and leaned against the wall. The humid evening air felt cool compared to the heated atmosphere inside. He didn't understand anything. He had expected to see broken enemies begging for a piece of bread. Instead, he saw a group of old men who were stunned by a simple roast beef. What the hell was going on here? He felt that there was something more to this than just food. That this steaming dinner on a metal tray was not just nourishment, but some kind of message that he, Leo Kowalski, could not decipher, but which his enemies understood all too well. A day passed, then a second, then a week. The ritual repeated with suffocating precision. In the morning, oatmeal with milk and brown sugar, or scrambled eggs with bacon. For lunch, a thick soup, ham sandwiches. For dinner, fried chicken, pork chops, beef stew, and always white bread, butter, jam, and coffee. Real, aromatic coffee with real sugar. For Leo Kowalski, these days turned into a series of disappointments. The hatred that had fueled him began to wane, giving way to a gnawing confusion. He continued to slam the trays down, but the generals seemed to have stopped noticing him. They were engrossed in their strange, silent meal. After dinner, they would sit at the table for a long time, and the barrack would fill with the murmur of their conversations in German. Leo began to linger by the door, listening. "It's not the quality, it's the quantity," General Straube, the former logistics genius, said in his low bass. "Think about it. This is the ration for prisoners of war. Not for the elite, not for a showcase. This is the norm. How many of these camps do they have? Hundreds? How many prisoners? Millions? And they feed them all like this. Every day. Calculate the tonnage. Flour, meat, sugar, coffee. This isn't an army fighting, Arnheim. It's a Ford assembly line fighting." Admiral Klug, swirling the dregs of coffee in his mug, added, "It's the sea lanes, Straube. All of this comes from somewhere. South America, the Caribbean. Their ships cross the Atlantic as if it were a pond. Unmolested. We thought we had a stranglehold on them. We were deluding ourselves. While our U-boats were sinking, they were shipping coffee beans. This coffee, it is the taste of their absolute control of the seas. We never stood a chance." Von Arnheim remained silent for a long time, staring at his hands resting on the table. The skin was dry, the knuckles prominent. He remembered the last months in his command post near the Oder. The endless reports of shortages. No fuel for the panzers. no ammunition for the artillery, no bread for the soldiers. He remembered a banquet at the Reich Chancellery in 43, after the victory at Kharkov. Gilded plates, crystal glasses, mountains of exquisite food that seemed tasteless and hollow even then. The finest chefs of the Reich had to perform miracles with ersatz products, with second-rate ingredients. There was champagne, but the roast was tough. The pastries were beautiful, but made with saccharin. It was a facade, a magnificent, desperate facade. And here, in a prison camp, thousands of miles from home, his jailers served him a simple piece of meat that was more tender, potatoes that were creamier, and coffee that was more fragrant than anything served at that high-table banquet. It wasn't mercy. Mercy would have been a guard sharing a piece of his own ration. That would have been a human act, something he could understand and even respect. This was different. This was impersonal. This was logistics. This was the casual, effortless display of an industrial might so vast, so profound, that it could afford to feed its vanquished enemies better than the Reich could feed its own marshals. The food was a daily, irrefutable report on the enemy's strength. It was a weapon of overwhelming truth, served on a metal tray. The one who could not accept this was Rommelbauer. The SS brigade Führer ate with a grimace of disgust, as if every bite were poison. "It's a trick," he would hiss. "They are fattening us up for slaughter. Or it's a psychological ploy to make us weak, to make us yearn for their decadent comfort." "Weak?" Straube scoffed one evening. "I have not felt this strong in 2 years. My mind is clearer. The constant gnawing in my stomach is gone. That is not weakness, Brigade Führer. That is efficiency. Their prisoners are healthy. Less disease, fewer problems. It is simply efficient." "It's an insult," Rommelbauer insisted. "They mock us with their abundance." "No," von Arnheim said quietly, his voice cutting through the argument. It was the first time he had fully engaged in their debate. Everyone fell silent. "It is not an insult. An insult requires intent. It requires emotion. There is no emotion here. This is an audit. We are the bankrupt company, and this is the victor's balance sheet. And it tells us we were insolvent from the very beginning." He looked at Leo Kowalski, who was collecting the trays. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. The hatred in the young soldier's eyes was gone. In its place was a deep, unsettling confusion. He was beginning to listen. He was beginning to understand. And that, for von Arnheim, was perhaps the most profound humiliation of all. To have his soul laid bare not before a fellow officer, but before a boy who had every reason to despise him. The breaking point came on a sweltering Tuesday, 2 weeks into their captivity. The dinner was roast beef again, the same thick slice of meat, the same fluffy potatoes, the same dull green beans. The smell, which had at first been a shock, then a revelation, had now become a source of quiet torment. It was the smell of a life they had never known and a power they could never defeat. The generals ate in their now customary silence, a silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a creeping, corrosive shame. It was the shame of the survivor who eats well while his family starves. They were here, in this quiet corner of Virginia, growing stronger and healthier with each meal, while their wives, children, and countrymen were picking through rubble for a rotten potato. The white bread on their trays felt heavier than lead. Von Arnheim was pushing a piece of beef around his tray with a fork. He wasn't hungry. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, had surfaced. Berlin, winter of 1944. A briefing at the Wolf's Lair. After the meeting, there was a small reception. The Führer was present, his hand trembling, his face a waxy mask. An aide had presented him with a slice of apple strudel. Von Arnheim remembered the look on Hitler's face as he took a bite. a flash of desperate, almost childish pleasure in a world that was collapsing around him. A simple pastry had become a bulwark against reality. They were all living on borrowed time, sustained by illusions and ersatz coffee. He looked down at the food on his tray. This simple, honest meal was the antithesis of that strudel. It was not a comfort, it was a verdict. Suddenly, a clang echoed through the barrack. SS Brigade Führer Rommelbauer had shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. He swept his tray from the table, sending meat, potatoes, and coffee splattering across the wooden floor. "I will not eat this filth," he roared, his voice trembling. "I will not eat the bread of the enemy. It is a poison meant to rot our souls." He kicked at the mess on the floor. "Do you hear me? We are German officers. We should starve with honor, not grow fat like pigs for the slaughter." The other generals stared, frozen. Colonel Wallace's rules were strict about such outbursts. The door burst open, and 2 guards rushed in, rifles at the ready. Leo Kowalski was right behind them, his face pale. "What's going on here?" one of the guards barked. Rommelbauer stood panting, his eyes blazing with defiance, pointing a trembling finger at the food on the floor. This is a mockery." Von Arnheim rose slowly. His movements were weary, as if he were carrying an immense weight. He looked not at the guards, but at Rommelbauer. "Be quiet, Brigade Führer," he said, his voice low but carrying an authority that silenced the room. "You understand nothing." He bent down, his old joints protesting, and picked up the slice of roast beef from the floor. He held it in his hand, looking at it. He saw the guards, their wary eyes, their rifles. He saw Kowalski standing by the door, his expression a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. And he saw his fellow generals, their faces etched with shame and confusion. He turned to Rommelbauer. His voice was no longer that of a commander, but of a man utterly broken. It was a whisper that filled the entire barrack. "You call this filth? You call this mockery?" He held up the piece of meat. "Brigade Führer, I have attended banquets in the Reich Chancellery, feasts to celebrate our greatest victories, with the Führer himself." He paused, and the silence in the room was absolute. Even the cicadas outside seemed to hold their breath. "This," von Arnheim said, his voice cracking with a lifetime of suppressed emotion, "this prison food, it tastes better than our banquets." The words hung in the air, monstrous and undeniable. It was not a complaint. It was a confession, a declaration of total, unconditional surrender, not of arms, but of a worldview, of a national myth, of a personal identity. In that single sentence, the entire edifice of their pride, their sacrifice, and their supposed superiority crumbled into dust. Straube closed his eyes. Admiral Klug bowed his head. Even Rommelbauer staggered back as if struck, the fanatical light in his eyes finally extinguished, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. Leo Kowalski stood frozen by the door. At that moment, he finally understood. The roast beef, the white bread, the coffee, it wasn't about the Geneva Convention. It was about a power so immense it didn't even need to be cruel. The greatest humiliation was not a beating or starvation. It was this simple, undeniable, soul-crushing fact. The enemy's prison food tasted better than a victor's banquet. The hatred drained out of him completely, replaced by a strange, hollow pity that felt almost as heavy as his previous hate. He wasn't looking at monsters anymore. He was looking at ghosts. The guards, sensing the shift in the atmosphere from rage to despair, lowered their rifles. The tension had not dissipated. It had transformed into something heavier, a thick blanket of melancholy that smothered the room. They looked uncertainly at von Arnheim, who still held the piece of meat in his hand. "Clean this up," one of them mumbled to Rommelbauer, gesturing with his rifle. The SS general, his face a mask of shock, mechanically knelt and began gathering the scattered food with trembling hands. The act was more debasing than any punishment the guards could have devised. The next day, Colonel Wallace summoned von Arnheim to his office. The office was spare and functional: a wooden desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a large map of the United States on the wall. A fan whirred lazily in the corner, doing little to stir the humid air. Wallace, a man with a tired administrator's face, gestured for von Arnheim to sit. He didn't offer a cigarette. It wasn't a social call. "I read the report from last night, General," Wallace began, his tone neutral. "Corporal Kowalski's report. He was quite detailed." Von Arnheim sat rigidly in his chair, his eyes fixed on a point just past Wallace's shoulder. The brigade Führer was under a great deal of strain. It will not happen again. "I'm not concerned about it happening again," Wallace said, leaning back in his chair. The springs creaked. "I'm interested in the reason. Kowalski wrote down what you said. It tastes better than our banquets." "Is that accurate?" Von Arnheim's jaw tightened. To have his moment of ultimate vulnerability dissected by this American paper pusher was the final turn of the screw. It was an accurate statement. Wallace nodded slowly, studying him. There was no triumph in his eyes, no malice, only a quiet, professional curiosity. "You know, we follow the Geneva Convention to the letter. Section 3, Article 11. The food ration of prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops. It's a regulation, nothing more." "I'm aware of the regulation, Colonel," von Arnheim said stiffly. "Are you?" Wallace leaned forward slightly. "I don't think you are. You see it as a message, a display of power. It's not. It's a line item in a budget. It's a logistical supply chain. It's the result of a country that can produce so much food that feeding you this way is easier and more efficient than setting up a separate system for inferior rations. It's not a demonstration of our strength. It's a byproduct of it. We're not trying to impress you. We're just processing you." The word processing hit von Arnheim harder than any insult. It stripped away the last vestiges of the grand drama of war, of the epic struggle between ideologies. He was not a fallen eagle in a cage. He was a unit being processed. The food was not a psychological weapon. It was just food, its abundance a meaningless accident of a system he could not even begin to comprehend. This casual, thoughtless power was infinitely more terrifying than any deliberate cruelty. It meant they were so insignificant, they weren't even worth a proper, intentional humiliation. "I see," von Arnheim said, and the words were barely a whisper. The final surrender was not the one he signed in the field. It was this one, in this stuffy office, in the face of this calm, indifferent man. He had surrendered his sword, his army, his country. Now he was surrendering his own significance. "Good," Wallace said, as if closing a file. "You're the ranking officer here. Keep your men in line. We don't want any more incidents." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. As von Arnheim walked back to Block D under the oppressive Virginia sun, the world looked different. The green of the trees seemed too bright, the sky too blue. The air felt heavy with a prosperity he could now taste and smell. In the barrack, the other generals looked at him. The old hierarchies, the rigid Prussian discipline, it had all evaporated. They were no longer generals and admirals. They were just old men who had outlived their world. That evening, Leo Kowalski brought the dinner trays. He no longer slammed them down. He placed them gently on the table, his movements careful, almost respectful. He did not look at any of the generals directly, but his presence was no longer one of animosity. It was the presence of a witness, a young man who had stumbled upon a truth far older and more complex than his simple hatred. He collected the empty trays in silence and left. As the door closed, Admiral Klug spoke into the quiet. "So, that's it then." It wasn't a question. It was an epitaph. Friedrich von Arnheim looked at the empty space on the table where his tray had been. For the first time since his capture, he felt a profound sense of peace. The struggle was over. There was nothing left to defend, not even his own pride. There was only the quiet weight of surrender and the lingering, impossible taste of roast beef. Epilogue. The years that followed scattered the occupants of Block D to the winds of history. Generaloberst Straube, the pragmatist, was released in 1947. His encyclopedic knowledge of logistics and supply chains, which had failed to save the Third Reich, proved invaluable in rebuilding it. He became a highly sought-after consultant for one of the companies involved in the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle, spending his days optimizing the very systems of production and distribution that had once so thoroughly defeated him. He died wealthy and respected in 1971, a man who had successfully audited his own nation's bankruptcy and helped it return to solvency. SS Brigade Führer Rommelbauer was transferred from Camp Clinton to be tried at Nuremberg in one of the subsequent trials. He remained defiant to the end, delivering rambling speeches about betrayal and the eternal strength of the will. He refused to acknowledge the evidence of the atrocities his units had committed. He was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and was hanged in 1948. For him, the truth served on a dinner tray was just another lie he chose not to believe. Admiral Klug lived out his days in a small house near Hamburg, writing a meticulously detailed, apolitical history of naval tactics in the Atlantic. He never mentioned the war's cause or its morality, focusing only on the cold mathematics of tonnage, speed, and firepower. He never drank coffee again. Colonel Miles Wallace retired from the Army in the 1950s and took a position as a university administrator. He ran the campus with the same impersonal efficiency with which he had run Camp Clinton, remembered by students and faculty as a fair but distant man who was obsessed with budgets and regulations. He never spoke of his time as a POW camp commandant. Leo Kowalski returned to Chicago, married his high school sweetheart, and took over his father's plumbing business. He raised 3 children and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He rarely spoke of the war, and never of his time as a guard. But sometimes, on a Sunday, when his wife would place a roast on the table, he would pause for a moment. His family would see a shadow cross his face, a distant, thoughtful look in his eyes. He would see a group of old men in worn uniforms, sitting in a stuffy barrack in Virginia, their faces a mixture of shock and shame as they tasted a truth more bitter than any defeat. The memory never left him. It was a quiet, complicated lesson about power, pride, and the strange, unexpected ways in which wars are truly won and lost. General Feldmarschal Friedrich von Arnheim was the last of the group to be released. He returned to the ruins of his family estate in what was now East Germany. He refused all invitations to join veterans groups or to write his memoirs. When a young, eager historian asked him for his perspective on the great strategic blunders of the Eastern Front, the old man simply shook his head. "We were defeated the moment our enemies decided to fight," he said. He lived quietly, tending a small vegetable garden, finding a simple, grounding reality in the feel of the soil. He died in his sleep in 1962. His neighbors found him in his chair, a book of Goethe's poetry open on his lap. They said he looked, for the first time in many years, at peace.